The Vietnam War fundamentally changed the United States in ways that are still felt today. The loss shattered the public's trust in the government, after years of being told victory was just around the corner. The war cost 58,000 American lives and divided the country more deeply than anything since the Civil War. The Northern Vietnamese proved that superior technology and firepower don't automatically translate to victory, and this was shown on a global stage. But what if we sent a fleet of modern U.S. drones back in time to fight in the Vietnam War? Could drone warfare have changed the outcome? Let's overthink this one. Now, to set this up properly, we need to establish what we're working with. Modern military drones fall into several categories. You've got the big strategic assets, like the MQ-9 Reaper, advanced drones that carry up to 3,800 pounds of Hellfire missiles and laser-guided bombs. Equipped with high-definition cameras, these drones can identify individual people from 25,000 feet up. Then there's surveillance platforms like the RQ-4 Global Hawk that can monitor entire provinces continuously. And on the tactical level, you've got smaller drones like the RQ-11 Raven that infantry squads use to peek over the next hill. For this scenario, let's say we're dropping this technology into 1965 at the start of major American involvement. We'll give the U.S. military about 50 Reapers, 10 Global Hawks, and enough tactical drones so every company-sized unit has access to real-time aerial reconnaissance. Other than the drones, we're keeping everything else from the war the same troop numbers, same ground strategy, same political constraints back home. The only difference is replacing period aircraft with modern drones where applicable. Let's look at what this actually changes by examining the three most critical battles and operations where drones would have made the biggest difference. We'll start with the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, the first major engagement between American forces and the North Vietnamese Army. This battle is important because it established the template for how the entire war would be fought. American helicopter mobility and firepower versus the NVA's ability to mass forces and disappear into rough terrain. Here's what actually happened. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry inserted into landing zone X-ray via helicopter without solid intelligence on enemy positions. They walked almost immediately into a force of roughly 2,000 NVA soldiers from the 33rd and 66th Regiments who'd been staging in the area. The Americans had helicopter support and artillery, but they were essentially fighting blind. They didn't know where the NVA positions were, how many forces they faced, or where reinforcements might be coming from. The battle turned into a desperate close-quarters fight that lasted 3 days and cost 237 American lives. With modern drones, this plays out completely differently. Before the insertion, Global Hawk surveillance would have identified the NVA staging areas in the Chu Pong Massif. Thermal imaging would have spotted the concentration of 2,000 men even under jungle cover. You can hide from visual reconnaissance, but you can't hide the heat signature of that many people, their cooking fires, their supply dumps. The Americans either don't land there at all, or they land with full knowledge of what they're walking into, and can position artillery and air support accordingly. But here's the more dramatic difference. The actual insertion at X-ray involved UH-1 Huey helicopters making multiple trips to ferry troops in, because each helicopter could only carry about 8 soldiers. During those vulnerable insertions, the Americans had fire support from helicopter gunships and F-4 Phantom jets attacking suspected enemy positions. If we replace those F-4s with Reapers, you've now got precision strikes. As NVA troops maneuver to assault the landing zone, Hellfire missiles take out their squad-sized formations with no risk of hitting friendly forces nearby. The NVA's big advantage at Ia Drang was their ability to get close and swarm American positions in human wave attacks that negated American firepower advantages. Drones with thermal imaging would track every squad moving through the jungle in real time, and precision munitions would break up those assaults before they reached American lines. The NVA also had reinforcements. The 33rd Regiment had additional battalions nearby that fed into the fight over 3 days. With drone surveillance, the Americans would watch those reinforcements moving into position hours before they arrived and could interdict them with precision strikes or reposition their own forces. Realistically, the Battle of Ia Drang with drone support probably ends with 10 to 15 American casualties instead of 237, and NVA losses climb from their actual 600 to 1,200 to probably 1,500 to 2,000. This new outcome establishes that American forces can land anywhere without fear of walking into ambushes. Now let's jump to the real turning point of the war, the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. It was a strategic surprise, even though American intelligence knew something big was coming. The problem was that intelligence in 1968 meant aerial reconnaissance photos that had to be developed, human intelligence from interrogations and informants, and signals intelligence from radio intercepts. All of that takes time to process and analyze. The VC massed roughly 80,000 troops for the offensive, but they did it in small groups that infiltrated cities disguised as civilians or moved at night through terrain American surveillance couldn't effectively monitor. The attacks hit everywhere at once. Viet Cong sappers attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. NVA forces seized the old imperial capital of Hue and held it for nearly a month. Bases in cities across the country came under assault. The Americans and South Vietnamese eventually threw back every attack and inflicted catastrophic casualties, but the scale and coordination of the offensive shocked the American public and turned opinion decisively against the war. It was a military defeat for the communists, but a strategic victory in terms of damaging American sentiment for the war. But in this new scenario, with global hawks maintaining 24-hour surveillance over major cities and their approaches, this attack becomes nearly impossible to execute. Pattern of life analysis would flag the movement of thousands of military-aged males into cities in the weeks before the offensive. Think about what that means in practice. Drones watching Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and dozens of other cities continuously. The software identifies baseline patterns. How many people normally move in and out, what normal traffic looks like. Then in the weeks before Tet, you've got anomalies everywhere. Groups of young men arriving and staying, weapons being moved at night. Thermal imaging picks up metal and recently fired weapons. Supply caches being pre-positioned in civilian buildings. In our timeline, American intelligence knew an offensive was coming, but couldn't pin down the scope or timing. With drones, you'd have specific intelligence, 500 VC fighters staged in this neighborhood, weapons cache in that building, command element in this safe house. You'd watch the assault forces moving into final positions the night before the attacks. The Tet offensive depended entirely on tactical surprise to get inside American and South Vietnamese defenses before they could organize. Take away that surprise, and the attackers are instead hitting prepared defensive positions with forces that have already been spotted and mapped. Realistically, one of two things happens. Either American commanders see it coming so clearly that they preempt the offensive, hitting the staged forces before they can launch, or the offensive happens, but gets devastated because the defenders know exactly where the attacks are coming from. The VC assault on the U.S. Embassy, which became the iconic image of Tet, never makes it through the wall thanks to advanced recon provided by the drones. The battle for Hue, which took a month of brutal urban combat to retake, looks completely different. The NVA infiltrated roughly 10,000 troops into the city before the attack. With drone surveillance, American forces watch that infiltration happen and either prevent it or know exactly where the enemy is when the fighting starts. Urban combat is brutal, but it's dramatically less brutal when you have real-time surveillance showing which buildings are occupied and where enemy forces are moving. Without the psychological shock of Tet, American public opinion doesn't turn as sharply against the war in 1968. That's potentially the biggest strategic impact of drones, preventing the political turning point that was a key factor in the American withdrawal. Finally, let's talk about the strategic backbone of the entire war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a massive network of routes running through Laos and Cambodia that North Vietnam used to move troops and supplies south. At its peak, the trail was moving roughly 20 tons of supplies per day, plus thousands of troops infiltrating to fight in the south. The U.S. tried everything to cut this trail. Operation Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound involved constant bombing of suspected trail segments. The problem was fundamental. Reconnaissance aircraft could only cover areas intermittently. Bombing was area-based rather than precision, and the North Vietnamese just rerouted or repaired damage overnight. In 1968, the U.S. tried something more sophisticated, Operation Igloo White, which involved dropping thousands of acoustic and seismic sensors along the trail to detect truck movement. When sensors were triggered, aircraft would bomb the area. It was moderately effective, but easily fooled. The North Vietnamese learned to trigger sensors with decoys or just moved outside the sensor fields. Here's what the numbers looked like. From 1965 to 1968, the U.S. flew roughly 300,000 sorties against the trail and dropped about 2.1 million tons of bombs. The estimated interdiction rate was maybe 20 to 30% of supplies. That means 70 to 80% was still getting through. For every truck destroyed, 3 made it and the trail kept functioning. But replace this entire system with 24-hour drone coverage and the math changes dramatically. A global hawk can monitor a 40,000 square mile area continuously. Position 3 or 4 of them along the trail network, and you've got constant surveillance of the entire system. Thermal imaging spots every truck, every porter, every supply cache. Once found, Reapers put hellfires on specific targets, not area bombing that might hit trail segments, but precision strikes that destroy actual trucks and supply dumps. Think about what this means operationally. In the current timeline, a truck convoy starts moving at night, travels for a few hours, and parks under camouflage before dawn. Maybe reconnaissance spots them, maybe not. Even if spotted, by the time strike aircraft arrive, the trucks might have moved. With drones, you track that convoy in real time from the moment it starts moving. You watch where it parks. You put a hellfire through the roof of each truck with near certainty. The North Vietnamese adapted to bombing by dispersing. Instead of large convoys, they moved supplies in small groups. That worked against area bombing but doesn't work against precision surveillance. A drone spots a porter with 50 pounds of supplies just as easily as a truck carrying 5 tons. The question becomes whether it's worth expending a hellfire missile on a single porter. But here's the thing. You don't need to hit every porter. Hit the trucks, hit the supply dumps, hit the way stations, and suddenly moving supplies by porter becomes prohibitively time-consuming. Let's run some numbers. The North Vietnamese were moving roughly 20 tons per day at peak. With constant drone surveillance and precision strikes, let's say you achieve a 70% interdiction rate, which is conservative given the technology advantage. That means only 6 tons per day gets through instead of 20. Over a year, that's cutting supply flow from 7,300 tons to about 2,200 tons. That doesn't shut down the trail entirely, but it's a massive reduction that fundamentally changes North Vietnam's ability to sustain operations in the south. In the actual war, major NVA operations required months of supply buildup. Battles like Khe Sanh or the Easter Offensive involved pre-positioning thousands of artillery shells, ammunition, and food. Cut the supply flow by 70%, and those operations either don't happen or happen at much smaller scale. The strategic impact compounds over time. In 1968, North Vietnam could replace losses and continue fighting. By 1970, with sustained 70% interdiction, they're struggling to maintain force strength in the south. By 1972, major conventional operations become impossible without drawing down forces in the north. So what does all this add up to? Let's be realistic about the overall impact. These 3 changes, dominant tactical intelligence at battles like Ia Drang, prevention or crushing of Tet, and effective trail interdiction fundamentally alter the military picture. American casualties probably dropped by 35 to 40% over the course of the war. Instead of 58,000 deaths, maybe 35,000 to 38,000. Enemy casualties climb by 25 to 30%. The kill ratio goes from roughly 10 to 1 in America's favor to maybe 15 to 1 or 20 to 1. More importantly, the war feels different politically. Ia Drang-style battles become routine victories with minimal friendly casualties instead of costly fights. Tet doesn't happen, or happens and fails completely, so you don't get the psychological shock that turned American opinion in 1968. And the steady attrition of trail interdiction means North Vietnamese forces in the south gradually weaken, rather than being continuously reinforced. That probably buys time. Instead of public support collapsing in 1968-69, maybe it holds through 1970 or 1971. The question is whether that's enough time for the South Vietnamese government to develop genuine legitimacy and build an effective military that can stand on its own. But here's where we need to be honest about the realities of the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese weren't fighting because they had good supply lines or favorable casualty ratios. They were fighting for unification and to push out foreign invaders. This was something they'd already spent 9 years fighting the French to achieve, and so they were willing to accept enormous casualties if that was what it took. The question with Vietnam was never if America could kill more soldiers than the North, but rather whether American political will could outlast North Vietnamese determination. Additionally, the South Vietnamese government the U.S. was backing struggled with legitimacy, and this would not have changed with the addition of drones. Bottom line, modern drones would have fundamentally altered the 3 most critical aspects of the Vietnam War. But the war wasn't lost because American forces couldn't see the enemy or kill them efficiently enough. It was lost because the political foundations were unstable, and North Vietnam was willing to outlast American public will. Drones are a massive tactical and operational advantage that might have bought enough time for a different outcome. But they're not the strategic silver bullet that would guarantee victory. The most likely result is a longer war with better American performance, ending with either a negotiated settlement more favorable to the South, or, if enough time is bought for South Vietnam to stabilize politically, possibly ending up in a divided Vietnam, similar to how Korea is today.